70 to 80% unemployed in countries around the world. What is this group of people who has such a huge unemployment rate? Autistic people. I mean, in just a few of the most developed countries in the world that ironically have laws protecting employment for disabled groups, which usually includes autistic people, the employment rates are low. Australia, 27.3%, the UK, 29%, the US and Canada, 14%. Globally, in many countries, autistics are either the least employed or one of the two least employed groups of any disabled group. But what's worse is, this isn't because autistic people don't want to work. A recent study in the UK found that 3 out of 4 autistic adults do want to work. So why is it so hard for autistics to find and keep employment? A lot of it comes down to communication, but we can change that. First, if you're new here, I'm Debbie, and I oversee a neurodiverse staff in my workplace, and I'm also married to Chris, who's a late diagnosed autistic ADHDer. I've learned, and am still learning, a lot about the communication differences between non-autistics like myself and many autistic people. So let's dive into that. Why are autistic misunderstandings common in workplaces? Miscommunications and misunderstandings can happen anywhere and in any workplace, but usually there's an assumption that we can work it out. We talk a little bit more, we're always careful not to rub people the wrong way, but if something is confusing or misunderstood, we'll come together and we'll sort it out. But how about if you have trouble talking to one person in particular, and you've come to just write that person off as cold or rude or just someone that you don't really want to talk to? You might be a little bit biased. And then when something does come up that could be a misunderstanding or just a difference in the way you think something should have been done versus how it actually happened, you're probably not going to just let them off the hook by saying, "Oh, that's just a misunderstanding." You might immediately become frustrated and a little bit sour, and then you go and talk to them and say, "Hey, that email was awful. Forget it. I don't even want to work with you." Or, "How many times have I told you to greet the customer with a cheerful tone? You sounded so rude." This unfortunately is common for many autistic people, and it leads to autistic people, both diagnosed and undiagnosed, running into problems at work. They might get written up or disciplined or passed over for promotions, or very commonly, bullied, ostracized, or attacked with passive-aggressive behavior by other people who are nice to everyone else at work except for them. And they might have no idea why. How long would you want to work in a place like that? Whew, not sure I would last long with that either. But a lot of non-autistic people just don't understand the struggles with communication that can arise through unclear or indirect communication, leading to ambiguity for autistic minds that might be very literal, or the expectation that all communication will always follow non-autistic communication rules. Studies show that non-autistic people often misunderstand autistic people's mental states, intentions, and behaviors, and that non-autistic adults rapidly form negative first impressions of autistic adults that result in reduced social interest in autistic people. In other words, from the very first exchange, people in workplaces and out in life are like, "Nope, I don't really want to talk to that person, and now I have a negative impression of anything they say or do." Which connects right to the double empathy issue, which originated from Dr. Damian Milton. We have a full video on that I'll link in the description below. But since this is relevant, here's a short-ish rundown of the idea. It's the idea that when people with very different worldviews interact, they're going to struggle to empathize with each other. So, what happens most often is there's a miscommunication or a misunderstanding between an autistic and non-autistic person, and the communication breakdown is blamed most frequently on the autistic person, even when no one knows they're autistic. They're often the person, maybe in the office, who everyone has a hard time communicating with. And let's face it, the definition of autism in the DSM-5 literally includes persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. But what if that definition of autism as a deficit is actually only a deficit because normal communication is based on non-autistic communication standards, and because that's the majority of people? Because other studies also show autistic to autistic communication doesn't have these issues very often, and miscommunications between them happen at about the same rate as communication between two non-autistic people. So sure, there is a gap in mutual understanding that impacts empathy, perspective taking, and social perception. Not because of an intentional misunderstanding or miscommunication by the autistic person, or careless talk or something like that, but because there are actually different social norms for autistic communication. The judgments of autistic people by non-autistic people often encompass a lot more than just the words spoken. It'll often include judging the delivery and tone of voice, as well as the volume of the person speaking, the facial expressions and body language, which can be complicated because an estimated 50% of autistics have alexithymia, which is trouble identifying or expressing emotions, which means that interpretations of facial expressions or body language will often be inaccurate. Directness or bluntness or rude phrasing. So for example, someone's saying, "That's wrong," versus saying, "I don't think that's quite right." But think about how unclear that can be. Like working with a designer and saying, "Well, that's not what I want." Or saying, "This isn't quite what I was looking for." Well, which part? All of it? Something else to note is that all of these are very cultural, even among non-autistic people. So they can look different for extroverts versus introverts, or North Americans who stereotypically are a little more extroverted or outgoing versus East Asians, who are often a little more reserved. And those are vast generalizations, but the point just being is how you interpret things isn't always the reality. It's just your perception. But along with the fact that it just isn't very fair that non-autistic communication norms are always assumed to be the best way, let's look at some other reasons that it's beneficial to improve communication and to continue to hire autistic people in the workplace. Honesty and a sense of moral justice. Many autistic people feel a sense of moral justice, which means that when they see something that's wrong, they will not only want to fix it a lot of the times, but also will often say something about it, rather than just letting it go as many other people might do. So things like company inefficiency or ethical issues, not only are autistic people more likely to report it, but they're also less likely to engage in unethical behavior. According to a study done last year, autistic employees are more likely to do something or say something when they see something wrong happening in the organization. They're also not so influenced by the bystander effect, which is basically the tendency for people to be less inclined to assist others when they're in a group compared to when they're alone. Some of the biggest corporate fraud cases in recent history, like the Purdue Pharma scandal, were shocking in part because hundreds of people knew about it and said nothing due to the bystander effect. But research shows autistics are not so swayed by others because they often aren't part of that collective group anyway, which makes them freer thinkers and also more likely to not stand by and knowingly allow something unethical to happen. Loyalty. Because many autistic people seek out careers that they want to do and they feel strongly about, they often stay in one place for a long time. How awesome is that for employers? That means the person could be a long-term fixture in your workplace, which can help company culture, reduce turnover, and reduce the time needed for recruiting, and help the employee become better and better at their job. What's not to love about that? This is also directly connected to the autistic desire to keep routines and repetition and to reduce change. Autistic people often want to stay at one company long-term, and in my experience, can be some of the most loyal employees of all, once you get to understand how to communicate well and work well with them. While they also might need to have some additional support or adjustments made, realistically, all employees do, but in different ways. And the time invested can also translate to long-term stability. And here's an example. The software company, SAP, is one that has actively recruited autistics because of the great skill set and work ethic that many of them bring, as well as the excellent attention to detail that's really important to their line of work. And they've also reported a 90% retention rate for their autistic employees. The fact is that supported employees, autistic or non-autistic, will often stay longer at one company than ones who don't feel support. But autistics are unique because they don't always have the same pull that other employees might to change pace or try a new position or just try a different company just to try it because they want to stay within that company. They really enjoy the structure and repetitive, predictable work that many workplaces can offer. So ask yourself, what do you value most in your company? And what's most important to you? Camaraderie or efficiency? It doesn't have to be an either-or situation if people can get to better understand autistic communication and don't do things to isolate them. So here are some things you can consider. Large teams versus individual or small groups, like 2 to 3 people. Many autistic people will prefer to work with just a few other people regularly. This gives less people to communicate with and possibly have miscommunications with, like we talked about earlier with the double empathy issue. Perhaps they're part of a larger team, but maybe they don't have to attend all of the huge meetings. And keep in mind that small groups will often be better for your introverts too. Efficiency. Autistic people are less influenced by social environment and social influences. They might report company inefficiency or not, but they're also less likely to partake in things that break rules when they want to follow their moral work code of getting things done and doing their job well, especially if it's work they enjoy. And you can see this because it's not just SAP and some of the intelligence agencies of the world that are seeking out autistic people to hire because of the great value they can bring. More and more companies are publicly stating that they seek autistic employees. Microsoft and SAP are a couple big ones to note, but also companies like EY, Ford, and Home Depot are creating programs to hire more autistic people. And from my own experience, having a neurodiverse staff has only brought positive benefits to my company culture. So what can you do? There's a lot that you can do. And as someone who oversees a neurodiverse staff, I'm going to share ideas for employers or supervisors, as well as those of you who are autistic or might have ADHD, to give you ideas for accommodations that you could ask for at your workplace. And keep in mind, for some of these, you wouldn't necessarily even need to disclose your autism or ADHD diagnosis if you didn't want to. I'll also have another video specifically on this topic, so be sure to subscribe and check the link in the description below. Get to know how all your staff works, especially the neurodivergent staff, and figure out how and why they work the way they do. Or if you're neurodivergent, think of how you work best. Is it in a quiet or distraction-free spot? What does distraction-free even look or sound like to you? So some examples can include how you structure meetings. Are they all going to be in person, or are you going to give a virtual option? Or could people watch a virtual option that's recorded and maybe participate in it later? Common work areas. Is it distracting for you to be near a spot where there might be clanging dishes or people talking and having a conversation? Schedules for meal or work breaks. Understand that a lot of autistic staff want consistency and routines. So for example, the same time for lunch every day, if it's not a set time where everyone in the office or workplace takes lunch together. Consistent meeting times each week, or based on a schedule that you need, can also be really helpful. Practice autistic-friendly communication. Having less meetings in person and more written communication where the autistic person doesn't have to mask during the meeting time or while talking in person can be really helpful. This also gives more processing time for the autistic person who might struggle with processing too much information at one time due to sensory sensitivities, monotropic thinking, and a whole range of other challenges during in-person communication. If you're autistic, ask for what you need. If it's a longer time to process, say that. Sometimes I need a little bit of time to think, so I'll listen carefully, but I might need to think about it before I respond. So I really appreciate you understanding that. If it's something you can't decide on the spot, say that too. Like maybe someone is asking you to change work shifts next week, but off the top of your head, you're not sure that you can because you can't remember your schedule. You can say, okay, I need to check, but I'll let you know tomorrow. Or, I don't remember my schedule for this week yet, but I'll tell you after I check. Can I get back to you by Friday? Practice clear and concise communication, especially with deadlines. Don't keep it vague, be very specific. Be open-minded and ask for clarification when needed. Don't make assumptions because you might be wrong. This goes both ways, so maintaining a positive working relationship and clearing the air sometimes can really help with that. You can try saying, hey, sometimes when we're meeting, it's hard for me to tell what you're thinking, so I'm just going to ask you that periodically. Or, hey, I just wanted to check because I noticed that sometimes you're not making eye contact with me. Is that easier for you to be able to focus in that way? And then being understanding that that could be a possibility. What are some of the challenges you faced in the workplace, and how could it be improved? Drop some of your ideas in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with someone who you think could benefit. Also remember that you can and will find a place that values your contributions. Thanks for watching. They don't always, and they might not